So, how can we respond practically? Well, I do want to share a little bit that hopefully will challenge your thinking. But first, we need to recognize that fear limits our ability to recognize where God is leading and can cause us to miss opportunities. But let me also say, I'm not giving investment advice. Everybody has a different situation, but I do want to share a little bit on how different markets work so that you might recognize an opportunity. Now, let me preface this by saying, while we all know that you're supposed to buy low and sell high, the reality is, what I've seen from experience, how rarely people do that. In fact, the typical response is we like to jump into something that's moving, has what I call momentum, and trust that it's going to continue going higher. In other words, we buy high, hoping for higher. Great example of this is the last two real estate bubbles. What did we see? The markets had momentum and it creates something called fear of missing out. And so people were challenging, pursuing, frankly, overpaying for real estate because they didn't want to miss out. And recognize all markets are elastic. They will typically go too far in either direction, up or down, before they begin to snap back. And we've seen that both in the 2008 real estate crisis, and we've seen how prices have gone dramatically higher in this current real estate bubble, although I recognize some of you will challenge me on that, and that's okay. But what do we need to do? Well, let's talk about anticipatory and reactionary markets. Now, going back to momentum versus value investing. Personally, the more something is working, the better things are going, the more cautious I become. In fact, regardless of how good the news is, how the continued reports are affirming, the more that's happening, the more cautious, and it takes real discipline, the more cautious I want to become, because when things change, they tend to happen quickly. And again, remember, as I said, all markets are elastic, so when they do move, they tend to snap. So when things are going really well, I'm going to become more and more cautious. But when things are bad, in fact, the worse they get, the more bold we want to be. Now, whether you know him or not, Warren Buffett is one of the most renowned investors of all time. And he will frequently say the best time to invest is when there's blood in the street. Gruesome, but effective. So let's understand how some markets work. And I will share a couple of real world situations just to help you understand. Some markets are anticipatory. In other words, they're going to move not in reaction, but in anticipation of what's about to happen. And a great example of that are both the stock and bond markets. In fact, at the time of this recording, we're already seeing that this year, this stock market has seen significant declines looking towards tougher times, to higher inflation, higher unemployment, recession, etc. And other markets are reactionary. They will continue on until faced with the bad news. Real estate is a prime example of that. And although, again, most people will deny this, real estate is actually especially residential real estate, a very emotional market. And so it will tend to continue on in a direction until absolutely faced with information contrary. And so that's why you will often see, as we see right now, stock market declining, but real estate continuing on. And the challenge becomes it tends to draw people that direction. Now, I'm not saying that's not always the right response. I'm just trying to challenge your thinking. So real estate tends to react after the fact. Other markets like the stock market and the bond market tend to anticipate. Now, the reason this is important is I've had so many people talk about the challenge and like, Randy, how do we respond and should we avoid things? I've even had people say the stock market will never recover from this current downturn, which isn't even the most serious I've seen during my prior career. In fact, the downturn we've seen so far is moderate compared to what I've seen historically in my prior career. Why do I share this with you? Again, stock market is anticipatory, real estate is reactionary. Why this is important is recognizing that the stock market also will begin rallying long before the economy turns around. And what I've seen historically is people who just cannot face the fact that the stock market is truly going to go up because the news isn't yet turning good. And I've had so many conversations like this over the decades. And I'll give you a great example of how this has played out. 2008, because of real estate, we had a financial crisis. And if you don't recall, at the worst, the stock market declined by somewhere between 44 and 48% of its value, depending on which index you're looking at, which benchmark you're using. Regardless, that was severe pain. Now, interestingly, 2009, about May, middle of May roughly, we began to incrementally get back into the stock market. Now, I'm not giving investment advice, but we began to incrementally get back into the stock market. And this requires real discipline. Now, let me say when you can jump in with both feet. At that time, because of the severity of the downturn, we moved in incrementally. And as we continued to see either positive signs or sometimes just the lack of negative signs, we over time became fully invested. Now, in retrospect, we wish we had gone all in at that point because we had a fabulous 2009. And if I recall correctly, made something like 39% return that year. Now, why is that important? It's not timing. Let me say this. Don't fall into the trap of trying to find the bottom of any market. It never works. But rather, it's looking at where are we getting a value where we feel like even if it declines a little further, this is a great level for us to get in and start building our position. Now, let me, look at the contrary side of that. And I'm thinking of a very specific, I had a number of conversations, but very specific conversation I had with actually a pastor. In his community, the real estate values were particularly hard hit by the downturn. Now, remember, real estate also took many years to recover. His community was particularly hard hit in value, and he really struggled to see that values in the stock market could go up. He struggled to look beyond what he saw at that time. So what happens? He missed out on a tremendous move, and because he focused on real estate and waiting for that to start recovering to feel like things were working. And again, as I've said several times, I'm not giving investment advice, but I want to challenge your thinking because I am a firm believer in don't let a good crisis go to waste, but rather, God, show us where there's opportunity so we can be blessed. Why? Because God is wanting to use his people to be a blessing to others. And what do we need to do? We need to be the ones that have the faith, have the confidence, not to be foolish. This isn't like buying lottery tickets, but to not be caught up in the emotional challenge of the cycles, but rather able to start to recognize this may not be the bottom. There may be a few more bumps, but this is a great value to begin building the blessing. So how can we respond practically? Well, as we saw in the first video, we need to recognize the spiritual implications, but also taking time to have enough understanding and not looking to the stock market for the direction, but rather as we focus on the Lord, as the Holy Spirit is able to show us direction, having the confidence and enough understanding to, just like his people when they left Egypt, responded to his direction, that we can both recognize his direction and respond to it.